Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History every third Thursday of the month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information on all of our programs and services, can be found at our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our speaker today is David Murphy, the Senior Research Architect for the Nebraska State Historical Society. Dave has been with the Society since 1974 and is the author of numerous articles on architecture and place, including his most recent Scenery, Curiosities, and Stupendous Rocks, William Quesenbury's Overland Sketches, which was released late last fall. His talk today will discuss the sketches made by Quesenbury of the dynamic landscapes that he saw along the Overland Trail. David?
Thank you all for being here. This book was quite a project from a number of points of view, and it was difficult to figure out what to talk about. I could probably spend this whole hour talking about 4 or 5 different aspects of putting the book together and what's included. I did want to not read off the names of everybody who participated in this project, but I do need to acknowledge a number of entities and individuals. The State Historical Society and multiple staff, including the Gerald R. Ford Conservation Center that did the preservation work on the book, the NSHS Foundation, and their Ronald K. and Judith M. Stolz Parks Publication Fund in particular, the Omaha World Herald Company that made it possible, who purchased the book on behalf of the foundation, several people who assisted me in the field and the field contacts I made during the fieldwork phase of the project, and the University of Oklahoma Press, who did an absolutely beautiful job of putting the book together. In fact, it won the second place prize already for design in the scholarly category at the New York Book Show. I do want to mention Dr. Martha Sandwise, now at Princeton University. She's the one who did the painstaking research that ended up finding the book. If you can imagine trying to track down the genealogy of a Jones family in the United States, she somehow found the descendants of John Wesley Jones, who his descendants had the sketchbook in a trunk up in their attic. And they thought it was the work of Jones, but she was able to point out that it was actually William Quesenbury that did the work. Since it was not done by their great-grandfather, they decided to put it on the market, and a whole series of events led to the book coming here. Dr. Michael Tate, Michael Farrell, both contributed essays to the book, and research done by Michael Dugan at an earlier time also is very important to the project. Michael Farrell also contributed several of his quite stunning black and white photographs to the project. They introduce sections of the portfolio and also illustrate his own lecture. Bill Quesenbury, or William Minor Quesenbury, is the main subject of our talk and the main subject of the book. He was from Arkansas and was fairly renowned locally in his home state for a number of reasons. Michael Tate covers him extremely well in chapter 1 of the book, but his sketchbook is the main topic that I'm going to be talking about. Its pages are full of sketches, either one sketch per page, such as at the top where he turned the book sideways to draw a very wide panoramic view, Sometimes there's 2 on a page, and sometimes there are 3. Now, one of the difficulties of putting the book together was the absolute complexity of the stories that the images in the book elicited. We were not interested in trying to edit those out, and so we chose to look for a way to include as many stories as we could to illustrate the depth and the breadth of the subject matter that was included. Martha Sandwise's research into the early photography of the West, which coincides really with when these sketches were made, discusses the importance of using words together with the images. And many of the earliest photographers would caption their photographs or provide little stories to go with the photographs to make sure that the meaning was clear. So the connection of images and stories, or words and pictures, will be a topic that I'll kind of fold through the discussion. I'm not going to make arguments about any of this. I'm not going to cover these point by point, but I wanted you to be aware of some of the key terms and key ideas that I'll present. We also need to make sure that we understand the context of the sketches in their own space, in their own time, discerning what I'm calling the first moment of the sketch from a second and a third and perhaps more down the line. Our perceptions of them as to whether they are foreground or background sketches, and whether they are settings for story or are the story themselves. Ultimately, in terms of the story that I found in the sketches, space becomes an important component of what we need to think about. I know in history, time is our main consideration, but I think now more and more, if we include space into our considerations, we get a deeper sense of story and perhaps get a little bit closer to the truth of things. Now, topographics at the bottom is simply a word that I want you to become aware of. I'm not going to go into that in this talk. It's covered in the final chapter of the book in some detail. But it is an important term, especially in the 19th century, because it deals with the arts and sciences of recording space or things in space. This was something that was developed, topographic art and so forth was developed in the Low Countries in Europe very early on and became an important part of the European explorations of the world that occurred in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Those arts and sciences then became slowly a part of the exploration agenda that we conducted here in the United States. Charles Preuss was a Prussian, actually, trained, so he took advantage of that early training in Europe and brought it over to the United States. In fact, many of the first significant topographic artists associated with American exploration were Prussians that came over to do that kind of work. Preuss was one of them. He became famous for making his map for the Fremont expedition in 1842, but he also did landscape sketches to go along with some of that. Now, this is not one of his sketches. It's an engraver's interpretation of one of his sketches. Friedrich von Egloffstein was another of the major Prussian topographers, working with Joseph Ives on the Grand Canyon survey in 1857 and 8. He was the first to develop a survey, an actual scientific survey of the Grand Canyon area, and produced a shaded topographic map of his survey. He also made wide panoramic landscape sketches that are keyed to the map, so you can use the sketches and the maps together to get a fuller sense of the space that he's trying to record. Now, the first story that we encounter in this complex sketchbook deals with the first 22 sketches, and these were made by Bill Quesenbury on his way to California in 1850 as a part of a gold rush company that was formed in Arkansas. The images go directly with his journey in this particular case. He also kept a diary, And so a person can read the diary and the sketches together. Michael Tate has done a great job of talking about this in chapter 1. This is a detailed map of part of the Great Plains area, the first part of his trip. And his very first sketch was made at a crossing of the Arkansas River near some sandhills I'll show you later. But they're basically along the old Santa Fe Trail at this point. At Pueblo, they turn north and follow old trade routes along the Front Range, and then take off cross country and meet up eventually with the Green River. Now, his most developed sketches were made early in the trip, because at around Pueblo, as they started to move north, he was getting impatient with the slow pace of the wagon trains. He splits off with some friends and they pack horses instead. And for a while, they don't really go any faster than the train did, but eventually they start moving a little faster. Well, as he meets the main trail, we'll get into a little bit later, when he meets the main California road, then he really gets impatient. But at any rate, his sketches at that first part are fully developed. He even includes skies. They're all fully shaded. Very nice drawings showing Pikes Peak, for example, at the bottom of this particular page. His first sketch I mentioned was made at the lower crossing of the Arkansas. There's some sandhills in that area, and the first sketch really depicts a bunch of goofing off, people tromping around in the sandhills. Quesenbury himself has said that he stomped a big Q in the sand, and you could see it from quite some distance away. Another event that's recorded in the diary is they camped out on a little island of the Laramie River, and overnight the snowmelt brought the river up to the point to where they got stuck there for a couple of days. And we have an unidentified sketch, but we've been able to confirm indeed that this is of that event based upon the sequence of sketches in the book. Other things he drew that are of interest to Overland Trail historians, of course, would be probably the first visual depiction of Bent's old fort after it was abandoned by the Bent Company. It's of interest in this regard in that there are stories that the Bents blew it up so that nobody else could use it, but certainly this sketch doesn't show any signs of damage at all along the east wall. Another very interesting sketch is the very first depiction of what has eventually will become Pueblo, Colorado. At that particular time, it was simply a single adobe structure, a single compound, but that location then proved to be important later on, and it grew into a full-fledged city. Now, I mentioned when he hit the main California trail out here, that was near the Green River. And at that point, he saw all the traffic and kind of became panicked over competing for grass and things of that sort, and they began to move much faster. As a result, his sketches from that point on, for the most part, are simple, quick line drawings that he never finished. They are so sparse, in fact, that we didn't think that it would be worth the time, effort, and money involved to try to figure out what these scenes were depicting. And we're leaving that to people who know Nevada and Utah, should they be interested in doing that down the road. However, because he was traveling in a very small party, just two people packing on a horse, he did draw a couple of camp scenes. And of course, these are quite different than the camp scenes we see of large wagon trains circling up and so forth. So his route and the circumstances of his travel do bring us some very interesting kinds of views. Now, he did, of course, try to pan for gold, just as everybody else did, and like most people, he wasn't successful at it. He ended up taking a job with a newspaper in Sacramento for a while, and ultimately was just biding his time over the winter months. During the time he was working at the newspaper, however, he did run across another character. And I call him a character because he was, I think, a character. Perhaps you'll see later on. But at any rate, John Wesley Jones had come from Illinois, the same year, following a different route. He was unsuccessful in finding gold as well, but was also working a number of different jobs, including plying his trade as a lawyer, which he was trained at back in Illinois. But over the winter of 1850-51, Jones had this great idea to create what he called a Panto Scope, which is a giant panorama painting. They were very popular, certainly from the 1840s on, particularly of Western scenes. I think one of the famous ones was 1846, John Banvard's big panorama of the Mississippi River, which at that time was the West. Well, just a few years later, with the discovery of gold and people moving to Oregon and so forth, the West became what we now consider the West. His initial idea was to do a panorama painting of California, the mines and the settlements and so forth and so on. But shortly, not too long before he decided they were going to come back, he decided to add the Overland section of the adventure to his panorama painting. So he was in the process of finding and hiring a number of artists, particularly daguerreotypists, to form a troupe with him to travel back to the States, gather the daguerreotypes and sketches and so forth and other information that he would eventually use for this painting. Now, Martha Sandwise, based upon what we know of his venture, says his trip ranks among the most ambitious photographic projects in the history of the medium. And clearly that would, I think, probably still be true today. Quesenbury, there was another sketchbook that is held by McKendree College. It's a college that Jones attended, and he donated it. A number of sketches of California scenes and following the trip along the route through California and to the upper reaches of the Humboldt River in Nevada. And then the sketches stopped. We didn't pursue the sketches in that book because it was all of terrain that we didn't know. It's extensive enough work that it needs to be looked into by other people, I think. So we left that portion. But this is from that McKendree book, and it's considered the first sketch he made when the troupe was beginning to head back to the States. In our book, the westernmost scene that he created is this quick line drawing that shows Split Rock, which is a landmark on the trail, at the very far left of the sketch. You'll notice the caption says, "Joins west of daguerreotype at Devil's Gate." I'm filling in what the abbreviations stand for, but it is the one place in our sketchbook where reference is made to the daguerreotypes that are also being made on this trip. Then, of course, they follow the trip. We have 49 sketches that are from central Wyoming into western Nebraska in the book that the Omaha World Herald purchased. That was all part of Nebraska territory at the time, so we have a solid connection with those. But as they traveled eastward, then he was sketching a lot of the main scenes that would be found along the road or near the road. Independence Rock, the Black Hills, West Chain, which we now know is as Casper Mountain, near Casper, Wyoming. A view near Labonta, which in fact turns out to be a view overlooking Laprelle Creek, not Labonta Creek at all. Labonta was a well-known location along the road. Perhaps Jones didn't really know the name of Laprelle at the time that they were there. There's several indications that they didn't really know what they were looking at in terms of naming. And a lot of these features, keep in mind, we're in 1851. A lot of these features don't get names until much later in the century. Continuation of a canyon on the North Platte, view above Fort Laramie, several miles as it turns out, above Fort Laramie, a place now known as the Pine Ridge. And then we come across this curious note in the book, Platte River, September 19, 1851. And it's just a curiosity that they happened to come across the largest gathering of Native American Indians at the time, gathered for the Fort Laramie Treaty, or what's known more commonly as the Horse Creek Treaty. This was, they were intending on meeting at Fort Laramie, but because there wasn't sufficient grass for grazing, they moved the site to Horse Creek in western Nebraska. And in fact, we can see a meander of Horse Creek in the view, which gives us a good pinpoint on approximately where Quesenbury was at the time. Even though this is extremely simple sketch, his recording of the horizon line is absolutely dead on, and we were able to pin this down because of that. This is a feature, slightly higher feature, now known as Bald Peak. Later on, they would leave and go around on the far side of that and follow the route through Rubidoux Pass. And here, in fact, is a view from the top of Rubidoux Pass looking down the valley. You notice the caption says Scott's Bluffs in the plural, looking from the west, and we'll go into that in a little more detail later. Chimney Rock, of course, he would have sketched. He did a very detailed, actually two very detailed sketches of the rock. Probably his most elaborate sketch of the group from the 1851 series is his rendition of Courthouse and Jail Rock from the Plum Creek, or the Pumpkin Creek side of the feature. And the last sketch in the book is a very quick, very light rendition of what we now know as Ash Hollow. From above, looking down the valley toward the Platte River Valley in the far distance. Now that was the last sketch, and there were a number of empty pages in the book, so it wasn't as though, I don't think it would be true that there are more sketches that he made. The red line on the map shows the rest of the route that Jones would have followed, and scenes from that route would appear in his later Panto Scope, but we have no Quesenbury sketches for them. It's possible that he left the party at about that point, took off cross-country with some friends so that he could get back to his home in Arkansas. The St. Joe route, which would allow people to take the Missouri River down to St. Louis, wouldn't really have gotten him much closer to his home than simply taking off cross-country. At any rate, then, at the end of all of that, Jones collects all of his materials, sketches, daguerreotypes, written notes of various kinds, we think, and heads off to Melrose, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, where he hires a new set of artists to begin to put together his Panto Scope of California, Nebraska, and Kansas. We have no material remains of the Panto Scope itself. Fortunately, there is one panorama painting done by John J. Egan about 1850, a panorama of the Mississippi Valley. It's held by the St. Louis Art Museum and allows us to get some sense of what a panorama painting would be like. I'm going to shift here to show you that scene. What I showed you earlier was 3 different scenes from the panorama painting, and the way these would work, let me go back quickly. Here, this caricature of Jones is on stage. You can see the pitcher of water, the audience in the background, and what happens is these paintings would roll across the back of the stage, and he would present a lecture about what was being depicted in the scene as the scene was moved. So the way that would move in this particular case, I can get over here. Here we have one scene, and it would segue as they would move it to the next scene. It would segue across a feature. For example, the double trees, you can see they're part of both scenes, and they frame it on the left now. And then he would go to this scene and the lecture would continue. When he's finished describing this scene, then it would continue on and it would segue around those big rocks in this particular case and would go to a third scene. So that's more or less the way these big panorama paintings would be viewed by an audience with the lecturer in front. Sometimes they would have various things on stage to make it look more like a three-dimensional kind of presentation. At any rate, several of Jones's promotional items have survived at the California Historical Society. This one gives us the full title of his Panoscope, which as you can see is a very long and cumbersome title, but Nebraska appears very prominently. Many of the ads in the New York and Boston newspapers we were able to find, always highlighting that it was made from 1,500 daguerreotypes, which is a huge amount of photographic work. That's what Sandwise was initially looking for, is trying to find those daguerreotypes, and she ended up finding Quesenbury's sketchbook instead. This was intended to be a serial publication. We don't know that number 2 ever appeared, but this survived at California. He did work with John Ross Dix to publish a booklet about his enterprise. The first part of it is stories, some of them made up, maybe most of them, about his adventure and his venture in producing his Panoscope. And then the second half are poems to go along with the scenes in the Panoscope that were penned by Dix, we believe. This is a part of one of the publications that shows the whole Panoscope, the scenes for the whole Panoscope. It's divided into 4 different sections, and of interest to us is section 1, because the subject matter in section 1 includes the scope of Quesenbury's sketches that we got from the Omaha World Herald book. We'll review those very quickly. We see the ones in red are the only ones of those first section scenes that Quesenbury actually sketched. So that's leaving us with a lot of questions about, well, what was the role of the sketches in producing the whole thing? What was the material that was used to create the other scenes? I'm going to go to the treaty one, the second red one down, and simply talk about what we know about that scene based upon the scripts that have survived, is that the scene focused on Colonel Mitchell negotiating with the Indians and the, quote, gaudy plumage that they were wearing. It raises the question, well, did this sketch even form a part of that scene? It's possible that perhaps this was used as a background for the scene to show the extensive size of the gathering. 10,000 Indians is a lot of folks. I've speculated some on why Quesenbury didn't finish this sketch, and I'm guessing because he ran into a lot of people. He had extensive military experience, and I'm guessing that he ran into a number of folks that he knew and was maybe talking more than sketching during that time. But it does raise the question, are these wide panoramic sketches that he was drawing, are they simply backgrounds for something else that's going on in the foreground? It doesn't seem likely to me. At the time that he's making the sketch, the scene clearly has to be in the foreground of his attention. And to him, he's drawing foregrounds. And if you take his panoramas, convert them into the proscenium kind of format, and I'll show you what that is in a bit, then these things really fall way into the background and become so small that they would virtually not be meaningful at all as a visual part of a composition. Now that one characteristic I've mentioned, he draws wide panoramic views, almost exclusively during the 1851 field trip. Okay, bear with me again, if I can get this to work. Seem to have trouble here with this. Okay. Sorry about that. We couldn't get them both to come out at the same size. So this is the full, I've only showed you so far the middle section of the treaty sketch, simply because it's too hard to see. But if you see the whole sketch and look at it panoramically, well, whatever. For some reason, I can't seem to make that cursor work. If we look at the whole sketch, it is extremely wide and at a higher resolution, which I should have been able to show you. You could see many, many different teepee villages in this vast landscape. Now, the panoramic was a favored way of looking at the landscape at that period of time. It was new. People didn't look at scenes as though they were pictures. They tended to look around, and artists started to draw very vast scenes by looking around. This is a page from Goldsboro Bruff's sketchbook. You see how he did it? It's a scene at Chimney Rock across the top and across the gutter. He continues his scene, and then at this point, you see how this line connects? The X connects over here. So he literally made a sketch 3 leaves wide by using that particular method. Quesenbury either would turn his sketchbook on his side, typically if he needed to do something really vast. But other of his sketches are clearly not backdrops either, and the detailed views of Chimney Rock and several other sites would tend to prove that. Now, a point I want to make in reviewing how the sketches relate to the Panto Scope is to look back at some of the other evidence. From the very beginning that Jones started talking about his project, he said he was going to use daguerreotypes to make his painting. All of his promotional literature make a big deal out of the 1,500 daguerreotypes that were used to create the Panto Scope. And in some cases, we actually find daguerreotypes referred to as sketches, so it gets a little muddy in terms of what we mean by sketch. But the best probably eyewitness source is Benson Lossing, who at the time was working with Harper's Magazine and ended up being one of the most prolific and popular historians of the late 19th century in America. But he was eyewitness to the studio phase of the painting, and he said he procured sketches made from the daguerreotypes of Mr. Jones, which were then being transferred to canvas by Messrs. Chappell and several other artists. Well, it turns out that California Historical Society has several of the sketches that Mr. Lossing obtained. And you see here, they're like an 8x10 format. That's roughly the format of the proscenium stage. So all of the scenes are being converted or made to be proscenium format. And they're of interest for a couple of reasons beyond that. This particular one may be of the Jones troupe when he had the largest number of people with him. The small black wagon in the back appears to be the daguerreotype wagon. We see a couple of other supply wagons, and of course if you had 20 to 50 people traveling with you, which apparently he did in the early phase of the project, fewer during the late phase, you would need a lot of supplies to keep them fed and so forth. This is a scene for which we have not found a Quesenbury equivalent. Fort Laramie, which we know Quesenbury was there, drew a number of sketches around Fort Laramie, did not draw the fort, but this is the scene that appears for Fort Laramie in the actual Panto Scope, or something very similar to it. And it does not represent anything like any of Quesenbury's sketches either. These are all handwritten on each one of these sketches as made from a J. Wesley Jones daguerreotype view. Well, you do have to wonder about that to some extent, because here's the daguerreotype camera, or the wagon in the view. He purportedly witnessed this Indian battle and was right on the edge of it. Well, I think not. In actual fact, they heard about it. And this is a made-up scene that he used in his Panto Scope. Likewise is this one, that he got a little story published in Harper's Magazine about this one. Theoretically, they were attacked by Indians at the Steeple Rocks in southern Idaho, and he scared them away by pointing his daguerreotype camera at them and holding his cigar up to it as though it was a cannon, and they all fled. Well, if you believe that, then whatever. There's a lot of stories like that. And actually, if you read the different scripts that we found, or the pieces of script from the Panto Scope, he kept moving this event around, depending on where he wanted it in his show. So there's a lot of made-up stuff in the Panto Scope as well. But again, daguerreotype J. Wesley Jones, but here's the camera. So either there were more than one camera and more than one daguerreotypist, or he's making that up as well. This is the only one that doesn't have some other scene kind of sketched over the top of the natural landscape. It's near the great summit of the Sierra Nevada. And if you read Jones's scripts, the Sierra Nevada was the only part of the trip that he thought was of great scenic value. So what was Quesenbury drawing if he wasn't making drawings for the Panto Scope? If we stop here and say, well, his sketches helped produce the Panto Scope, and then we know that only a few of his scenes ever made it into it, then we kind of subordinate the sketches to the Panto Scope itself. We subordinate Quesenbury to Jones, and we ignore the rest of the sketches in the book. To me, that diminishes Quesenbury's contributions to the whole thing, and it keeps us from finding what might be a story that includes all of his sketches. And that was the tack that I tried to take as I approached this. So what I do then is I want to go back to the field and try to figure this out, because we don't have enough words, we don't have enough information to really tell us what was going on. I highlight daguerreotypist because, based upon Jones's work, that's what he put the most value in. But in order to produce the Panto Scope, we know that he had daguerreotypists, sketch artists, writers and lecturers, and naturalists with him. We know that based upon the scenes that appear, that they had to be recording landscapes, people in attire, mines, forts, towns, artifacts, flora and fauna. These are the people that made, on the left, that made it back with him. Jones claims to be the daguerreotypist, and some people think maybe Prue and Schufelt were as well. Eric and Sharp were partners in the venture. Quesenbury was a sketch artist. Coolwine, who wrote back to his hometown paper, Burlington, Iowa, a couple of times, said in one case that he was going to be joining the troupe either as a naturalist or as a note taker. In another letter, he says, I'm going to be coming back with a sketchbook full of sketches. So we don't exactly know what role Coolwine was playing, but it would be great to try to find whatever he had if it was still around. David Mitchell and Texas were mountain men that were hired to guide them back and to help protect them, and then they brought a number of immigrants back as a mini little army to try to protect themselves. So at any rate, as we work our way through the sketchbook, there are some, for example, Independence Rock, that are captioned so that we know what they are. Well, if you read Independence Rock, it immediately elicits the Overland story, I believe, does it not? And it elicits a connection to the Panto Scope as well. Same is true more or less for Scotts Bluffs in the plural, except the term that elicits the trail to us mostly is Scotts Bluff in the singular. So what's the story here? Well, again, thinking in terms of the space at the time of 1851, the Rubidoux Pass route was the route everybody was taking, and that's the route Quesenbury took. In 1851, they opened up what came to be Mitchell Pass, and apparently more people started using Mitchell Pass than Rubidoux Pass. That isolated, the road ran between the Scotts Bluffs and isolated the single formation that we now know as Scotts Bluff in the singular. So reading this stuff in its own time and its own space, we can begin to understand how the captions work and how naming changes over time. But what do we do with all these other sketches? Mountain west of road. That doesn't elicit either the Panto Scope or the Overland Adventure. View on the North Platte. Does anybody recognize where these are? So I go back into the field, into the scenic spaces to try to discern what the subject matter is. And I show you this one because we normally think, and I assumed at the beginning, that his sketches were made in order as they were moving back east. But we ran into an area where he was all over the place, going back and forth, as you can see, several times to pick up sketches. Now, in the final chapter of the book, we have found an event that happened where Jones actually was robbed by Indians and did need to be picked up and transported back to Fort Laramie. And I think Quesenbury, because the artists were out scattered doing their work, Quesenbury was unaware that his employer had been robbed, and I think he was going back and forth in part to try to look for him. Eventually, of course, they met up again at Fort Laramie. But at any rate, I went out and did my own topographic research to try to find out what the subjects of the sketches were and to try to figure out if there was a story to go with the sketches. Quickly now, I'm going to go through what I found. And of course, here we are back at the top of Rubidoux Pass, and he made several sketches as he moved down along this long wall of the Scotts Bluffs. Chimney Rock would be around the corner down here, just to the right out of view in that particular scene. But here's a drawing that's simply called North of Road. And of course we see what it looks like today. A pretty dramatic and interesting landscape. Another one, South of Road, is the only identification. We figured out that it's a large formation at the outlet of what's called Carter's Canyon, but at the time, Rubidoux's second trading post was located up that canyon. Canyon on the North Platte. To my knowledge, the canyons of the North Platte have never figured in the Overland story to any great extent. But at any rate, they were quite dramatic natural scenes. A small canyon entering into the Platte River Canyon. And in this particular case, you have a canyon that just simply cuts around a small piece of rock. It's a very kind of curious situation, and one that's repeated several times really along this landscape. We found that it's a Cottonwood Creek Canyon. This is just the mouth of it. I don't show the outlet. There's too many trees there now to try to get the view that Quesenbury drew. Red Buttes from the road near Willow Springs. Well, Red Buttes isn't near Willow Springs, but the road that Quesenbury was on is. And this turns out to be a very deep telephoto view of the Red Buttes, which were the only red thing that was visible in that landscape from that particular perspective. Quite dramatic natural scene. The view above near Levanta that I showed you earlier, you'll notice some curious little curves in the mountain that turns out to be an uplift of old layers of geological rock forming very curious kind of curves in the face of the mountain. Alkaline lakes from the east, these are the ones that they saw are fairly close to Independence Rock. They're very strange, very fascinating, very curious kinds of natural things. They're alkaline playa lakes. This large one, that is not water moving. It's just simply, I'm not sure I can explain to you what you are seeing there, but they're quite fascinating natural phenomena, whether they're wet or dry. And as they dry out, they become pretty curious as well. And of course, along the real dry edges, then you get all the white crusting and so forth. But the scenes are quite interesting visually. Devil's Gate, of course, another one of those curious cuts through rock, leaving a little section of rock suspended off to one side. This is quite far off of the road, actually, but it turns out that many people would take trips over here and explore this little canyon. Now, it was called awful Devil's Gate, like the gateway to hell and so forth and so on. An awful chasm it's been described at, but as near as I can tell, the only thing awful about it was that an awful lot of people took trips off the road to go explore around it. And in fact, here's another Quesenbury sketch, Independence Rock from Devil's Gate. Well, Independence Rock is shown off at the distance. Well, it's actually Independence Rock from the top of Devil's Gate. And likewise, many people, including Quesenbury, would take the time to climb up and take in the scenes that were available from up high. There's the meandering Sweetwater River from up above, more of the Sweetwater Mountains from up above. Independence Rock was another one of the great scenes. It became a landmark on the trail for a variety of reasons. Several people commented, it was theoretically named after a group that celebrated the 4th of July there one year, I think it was in the 1840s. Other people thought maybe its name came about because it's an independent rock standing out there alone in the middle of the valley, and so forth. But at any rate, it's a very curious feature because it's a very smooth piece of granite, and all of the mountains around it are extremely rugged. So it presents a very dramatic contrast in terms of visual appearance.
Where is that?
This is in central Wyoming, along the Sweetwater Valley after the road left the Platte Valley. And of course, the immigrants were out there at all sorts of times of day and night. This is a view at sunset, showing it in shadow, and some people said it looked like a beached whale, and the particular view kind of does. The views from above. People would climb this feature, and of course, we know that it was, the Register of the Desert, I think it was called, because at one time, it was almost completely covered with graffiti. People would leave their names there, would put their dates on it, would leave notes to other people hoping they would see it, and so forth and so on. Most of that's eroded away. There's a few of them still left. But the point of that is that a whole lot of people were climbing it because you can't put your name on top if you weren't climbing it. Chimney Rock. Again, is it the rock that is the most interesting thing, or like this Quesenbury view that shows the rock within a vast, interesting and scenic space? I think it's probably both. The rock itself is a curious feature, but it's also in a very vast space that itself, at various times of the day and from various angles, is quite a spectacular scenic entity in its own right. Now,
10 minutes.
pardon?
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. What I just showed you as the result of the field work in this sketch is I'm over here on the left because I've taken the sketches back out into this natural space itself to try to figure out what the sketches were. And of course, I determined that all of the sketches virtually were dramatic, vast spatial scenes that were enticing to immigrants. I decided then to go back to the diaries to see what other people were saying at the same time that Quesenbury was there. And in fact, I was able to find quotes reflective of a scenic sort of wonder for virtually every one of Quesenbury's sketches. So it wasn't just the way I was seeing the landscape, I don't think. I think that a very, very large number of immigrants were also participating in the enjoyment of some pretty dramatic natural scenery. I go back to this view because I mentioned people climbing. There's people walking along here. There's several people up on top. This was a view taken a few years ago. But the whole point of that, I think, is that there was a lot of adventure going on. It's true that some people got sick. Some people got sick and died. Some people had accidents, and some people had accidents and died. There were bad days and there were good days. There were horrible storms, but there were also perfectly pleasant days. And so added to that kind of traumatic, heroic story of the pioneers trudging across a vast desert landscape, I think we can now add the fact that a lot of people were having a heck of a lot of fun and enjoying what they were seeing at the same time. Here's a couple of details from a Quesenbury sketch showing people climbing Chimney Rock. And in fact, in the lower right inset, there's a guy with a tripod who had climbed up part way, and perhaps that's J. Wesley Jones himself getting ready to take a view from the rock. Same true of the Courthouse Rock sketch. There's people out exploring the terrain up above while Quesenbury is down below making his sketch. So then the hypothesis and the story that I decided to write was based upon that field work. Quesenbury is a sketch artist, and he's doing only this, landscapes, but in particular, landscapes that are scenery, curiosities, or stupendous rocks. And in many cases, the scenes that he draws are all three of those bundled together into one. That phrase, by the way, comes from J. Wesley Jones himself, who said that was one of the things that they wanted to do on their way back, is to record all of the scenery, curiosities, and stupendous rocks. So that story is another story, really, that I think emerges from the sketchbook in particular. The first spontaneous mass American engagement with nature. Derived the story from the immigrant diaries and the sketches together. It's built around an attitude characteristic of the time of immigrant exploration and adventure, occasioned by the new American awareness of natural scenery and geological time, which was very prominent, and heightened by the fact that the Great Plains is a vast horizontal space where these geological features really present themselves quite well. Paul Shepard, I think one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, first outlined this particular story in the early 1950s. Two of our noted historians of the Overland migration, Merrill Mattis and Robert Moncrief in Wyoming, have pursued that to some extent with revolving around the major landmarks since then. If that is a story, and I think it is, it's still one that needs to be told. And needs to be pursued in greater detail. I only pursued it for the book to the extent that it pertained to the sketches. So in closing, I want to just review. We need to keep track of the space and the time, the context of all of the visual materials that we run across and use in narrative, and make sure that if we're using it in a narrative that doesn't belong to the image, that we explain that in the course of our work. An example of this is a John R. Savage photograph of Chimney Rock that he made in 1866. Shows up in a pictorial format in Harper's Magazine the next year with added material. This is sort of like what Jones was doing, is adding material to his scenes and creating a new story. The two are, while they're the same view, they are completely different images and evoke completely different narratives. So I pursued the one on the left, which I think shows the sketches that we have in our book from the perspective of their original moments in time, in their original space, before the Panto Scope and before the construction of Overland history. On the right is the way the sketch might look if it's part and parcel of a number of images being used to create a Panto Scope, or project that into an Overland history scenario, or how many other stories will be evoked by these sketches as time passes. I just want to say in closing that this project was a very intriguing one for me, and I'm extremely, I think, blessed to be able to have been a part and parcel of putting this particular book together. This book kind of showed up out of nowhere, as though an asteroid from outer space had landed here. We had to figure it out, and I hope that we've done a good job of including all of the potential stories that the sketchbook may mean or have meaning for. Thank you.
How long did you spend doing this?
I have 4 to 5 years of real time that I did. And there were other ideas that had developed earlier. I think they started, the first ideas that were pursued started about 11 years ago, maybe. I think that's about when we got the book. And we didn't, I guess none of the people involved were happy with the way it was working out because there are too many stories in the book, and if we pursued one story, it didn't really fulfill our desire to explain the sketches and to portray all the sketches. So ultimately, when we get to the end, we end up with several different stories. Some of them almost conflict with each other. And so to put a book together in a way that allows that multiple voices to be heard all at the same time was one of the challenges, I think. So I started about 5 years ago, or I can't remember. I used to remember dates, but I don't do too well at that anymore. Any other questions?
One obvious one, how big was the Panto Scope physically?
Well, I'm not sure we actually know, but wasn't it something on the order of at least 9 feet high? And he said a couple of miles long. I think that's, well, in 4 reels. I mean, you can see the connection to cinema. I mean, those big paintings, he had 4 scenes, and they had to change the rolls or the reels. So he'd bring a drop curtain down, and they'd pull out another roll. And that roll probably would have been several hundred feet long, I guess. Or I'm not sure you can believe any of the numbers that you read until somebody actually has one and measures it. It would be. Now that Egan one, I think, was all in one, wasn't it? It was a shorter production. But
so was his similar to what's at the museum in Gettysburg?
Well, okay, I didn't really have time to go into that, but the original panoramas, you had to construct a special building for them because they were originally a scene that was painted if you turned around in a complete 360 circle and you painted everything around you. So in order for a viewer to view it properly, you had to mount it in a circular building, and you'd bring the viewer up into the middle of the scene via a stairway, and you would suddenly emerge into this big painting. Now those are cumbersome. I mean, you have to build special buildings for them. That's expensive. And at some point, people had this idea of, well, let's just do them as a linear thing. So by the middle of the 19th century, the linear ones were by far the most popular. And Gettysburg, I think, was later even, wasn't it? That's a more modern building. Pardon?
I think it was in the 1880s.
When the painting was done? Okay, but the building it's in?
The building it's in was rebuilt.
Rebuilt,
Yeah,
okay.
no, it's new.
There's an original building in Buffalo today.
Okay.
It's from when it was built for that purpose.
Do they have a painting in it by
So
chance?
it's an architectural office.
Okay, okay.
make whatever conclusions you want about that.
Mhm,
Nice job.
I suppose. There was, oh, back there.
Where can you get a copy of your book?
I believe in the gift shop right outside here, as a matter of fact.
There's a shill in the crowd.
That was, who planted you there?
He'll be glad to sign it.
Sure, if you want me to sign it, I'd do that.
Let's wrap.
It reduces the value, by the way. Whatever. At any rate, it's a beautiful book. I think Oklahoma Press really needs all sorts of applause for what they've done in laying the book out and designing it. I know everybody I know who has seen it thinks that it's quite a nice book.
It's going to be featured in New York, isn't it? Book fair.
It won second place in the New York Book Show for design. Uh-huh.
Getting a nice sign.
Well, I got done in time. Oops, sorry about that.